Welcome to this special session, The Past is Prologue. This is Dr. Tess Jones from the Center for Bioethics and Humanities. You will find a description of this session in your materials on Canvas. We will be reading and considering selected passages from narratives beginning with Thucydides in 5th century Athens through the AIDS crisis in late 20th century America. When I come to those passages, I will ask you to pause this recording, read the text on your own, and then resume the presentation. Your assigned reading is a rather long poem, And Who Shall Look Upon Our Testimony by Edward Hirsch. Hirsch wrote the work to be included in the first collection by American poets on AIDS. It is a remarkably accurate and detailed description of the outbreak of bubonic plague or the Black Death in 14th century Europe. If you haven't had an opportunity to read this poem beforehand, please feel free to pause this presentation and read through it now. Bubonic plague struck Europe in October 1347 when Genoese trading ships put into the Sicilian harbor of Messina with dead and dying men at the oars. The sailors showed strange black swellings about the size of an egg in their armpits and groin areas, which oozed blood and pus. These buboes were followed by black blotches on the skin from internal bleeding. The sick suffered severe pain and died within 5 days of the first symptoms. As the disease spread, other symptoms of continuous fevers and spitting of blood appeared. These victims coughed and sweated heavily, dying even more quickly, within 3 days, or sometimes less than 24 hours. The total reported dead in Europe was approximately 24 million. That was 1/3 of the entire population. The mortality rate among the clergy was greater than 50%. Italy suffered the heaviest casualties. Following bankruptcies, crop failures, revolutions, and war, the plague came at the peak of a series of calamities. For those who could afford it, flight was the chief recourse. The Decameron, written by Boccaccio during the plague, is a collection of 10 stories told over 10 days by young and wealthy characters who move from palace to palace in the Italian countryside. Edgar Allan Poe's short story Masque of the Red Death also depicts the nobility escaping and amusing themselves during an epidemic. While the rich fled to secluded estates, the urban poor died in their burrows. So many peasants died that the crops went unharvested and the livestock untended. The sense of a vanishing future created a kind of dementia of despair. Reaching out to us in a future that would be forever changed, the poet Petrarch cried, "O happy posterity who will not experience such abysmal woe and will look upon our testimony as a fable." Then, as now, disease outbreak is often interpreted as a sign of moral corruption. To many in the 14th century, there could only be one explanation for the Black Death: the wrath of God. A scourge so sweeping and unsparing could only be seen as divine punishment upon humankind for its sins. One professor of law wrote, "In the time of that great mortality, in the year of our Lord 1348, the hostility of God was stronger than the hostility of man." Sadly, however, this professor was wrong. The hostility of humans proved itself against the Jews. on charges that the Jews were poisoning the wells with the intent to destroy Christianity. Lynchings began in the spring of 1348 on the heels of the first plague deaths. In France, Jews were dragged from their homes and thrown into bonfires. While divine punishment was accepted as the plague's source, people still looked for a human agent to vent their hostility. And the Jews were the most obvious and feasible target, as they lived together in distinct parts of cities and towns. In Savoy, mock trials were held. Jews were imprisoned and their property was confiscated. 11 Jews were burned alive, found guilty of being plague carriers. In Basel in 1349, an entire community of several hundred Jews were burned in a wooden house, especially constructed for that purpose. Epidemics are both biological and cultural phenomena. Investigating historical accounts of plague and how they relate to contemporary epidemics like HIV/AIDS, SARS, Zika, and now COVID-19 can give us insights into how societies from ancient Greece to late 20th century and early 21st century America cope with catastrophic infectious disease. Not only do societies seem to respond in a similar fashion to disease outbreaks, but the way in which they are described is similar. Thus, plague narratives not only recapitulate the progression of disease and public reaction to it, but they also build one upon the other, consciously calling attention to the linkage between present and past accounts. Let's read through a few selected texts, all of which are the opening paragraphs of plague narratives. We can then identify similarities among them, and we can consider how societies respond to epidemics, how writers describe those responses, how people attempt to cope, and who is blamed, scapegoated, and persecuted. We begin at the beginning of what we consider Western culture, and the first historian, Thucydides, who chronicled the Peloponnesian War and the birth of democracy. Now take a moment to pause this recording, read through the passage on your own, and then click play on the YouTube video to resume the presentation. While Thucydides makes only a general reference to time in the first sentence, identifying when a disease outbreak begins becomes a feature of nearly all plague narratives. In addition, he notes that neither medicine nor religion provided effective remedies or effective cures for the suffering. And finally, he identifies the suspected source of the disease, Ethiopia. The body of the community is linked to the body of the individual in disease outbreaks. And one striking commonality among many of these narratives is the relationship of epidemic to political, social, economic, and environmental upheaval. In other words, writers frequently stress what we might call preconditions of outbreak, including war, famine, climate change, unmanageable migration of people from rural to urban areas for work, or to refugee camps for protection, and of course, any signs of moral degradation or social anarchy. When medicine stands ineffective in the face of dread disease, the temptation to explain the disease in cultural terms is pervasive and overwhelming. As noted, Thucydides links the failure of both medical interventions and religious rituals. Also linked is the desperate need to construct some explanation for what is happening and the need to blame and scapegoat. In plague narratives, disease always comes from a threat outside of the dominant social group and political system. Society gains comfort and hope in feeling that outsiders or socially disapproved groups are in some way responsible for the outbreak of disease. If these groups can be placed beyond the pale of society via stigmatization, isolation, quarantine, or even genocide, the epidemic might be brought under control. As I mentioned earlier, the Decameron was actually written during the Black Death. This passage is the opening paragraph of the prologue. Please hit pause on the video here, read through the passage on your own, and then click play to resume the presentation. Note that we now have a reference to a specific year, 1348, effectively fixing the historical moment. In addition, Boccaccio speculates on the source of contamination. Perhaps it is an outside force moving from exterior to interior, from macrocosm to microcosm. Perhaps it is the righteous anger of God for the sinfulness of humanity. However, he seems certain of one thing, that it came from the East, which continues to be, even now, targeted as a likely source of contamination. In the face of a seemingly uncontrollable and terrifying outbreak, humans take comfort in finding ways to manage what feels like the arbitrariness of disease. Thus, in addition to identifying who is responsible, there must also be some way to identify who is susceptible. This can include lifestyle, behavior, and environment. The structure of blame is that transgression implies punishment and illness implies prior transgression. The chronicler Rondinelli provides this account of a later eruption of the plague in Florence. Please pause this recording, read through the passage on your own, and then click play to resume the presentation. You have likely already noted the reference to time in the opening sentence. However, in this passage, we now not only have date and year, August 4th, 1630, but also time of day, sunset, marking the origin of plague. That specificity also extends to the source of infection, an individual. He is a foreigner, likely disguised as a Christian, or he is someone with some significant physical trait that sets him apart, such as red hair, and he carries a box. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year has been traditionally regarded as the most accurate accounting of the Black Death in England. However, it was written ironically after the fact. It is a novelistic recounting, a journalistic recapitulation of the plague based on survivors' accounts. As a journalist trying to prepare the public for future outbreak of plague, Defoe turned to storytelling, to narrative, knowing that public health education can achieve its purpose not through logic and prudence, but through passion and drama. Randy Shilts will do the same in his Chronicle of AIDS in the late 1980s. Okay, this is your cue. Hit pause, read through the passage on your own, and then click play to resume the presentation. In addition to the now conventional features of the passage, such as specifying the date, September 1664, and identifying the origin as a foreign invader, Defoe adds something new to the genre. He comments on the lack of responsibility by social and political authorities, as well as the lack of good information and the danger of misinformation. Defoe is the first chronicler to place individual experience within the context of public health. Next up is Charles de Martin's account of an outbreak in Russia, just 50 years after Daniel Defoe's. You know what to do. Pause, read, resume. De Martin's account coalesces a number of elements that we've already noted. The conditions of susceptibility, in this instance, war. The expression of xenophobia, in this instance, the Turks. And an attempt to understand human psychology when confronted with epidemic. In this instance, both individual and institutional denial and delay. Albert Camus' The Plague is usually interpreted as an allegory in which the consequences of the outbreak of disease are symbolic of the results of fascism in Europe. However, the novel can be read as a compelling psychological and social study of reaction to a catastrophic event. Please hit pause, read the opening sentences of this magnificent novel, and then hit play to resume the presentation. We see here the mildly curious, but mostly unconcerned scientist, Dr. Bernard Roux. As the protagonist of The Plague, he is a significant choice because as a physician, a healer, he will be faced continually with ethical decisions throughout the epidemic. What is also striking is that Camus describes Dr. Roux as literally stepping across a threshold. This is the precise moment when ordinary life will undergo complete upheaval. This is the distinct line that marks the before and the after of disease outbreak. The final example comes from Randy Shilts' monumental work, And the Band Played On. Shilts was a journalist for the San Francisco Chronicle, a city which was an AIDS epicenter in the United States. Shilts himself died from complications of HIV disease in 1994 at the age of 42. Last time to hit the pause button, read the opening paragraph, and then hit play to resume the presentation. Shilts uses chronological headings in the text as an effective way to tell this complicated story. The passage brings together many of the elements, the conventions that we've identified to situate his own plague chronicle within an historical and literary tradition. For example, he fixes the historical moment, July 4, 1976, the before and the after. He references the origin of the Black Death with an image of sailors putting into the harbor of New York. He paints a picture of unity and disinhibition, but suggests incipient chaos and contagion. And he points to Africa as the outside source. Epidemics are reminders of how humans are bound in a web of biological relationships, neither easily comprehended nor easily controlled. The chronicles and narratives of COVID-19 are already being written for future readers to understand how it emerged, who was to blame, and how it was controlled. I hope you've enjoyed and found this presentation interesting and enlightening. Please take care, please stay safe, and thanks for listening.